that we've been is this aspect of comfort in the letter. And tied to that, of course, and really it's almost like a synonym when you mention grace and comfort in that way. So as we get to this verse, which I really have more or less just selected to be the theme for our study, it's helpful for us to remember this is in the context of him challenging them. Sometimes when we're challenged, even in terms of points that maybe brethren are not saying, well, this is not a command. You know, they're saying, they're not saying this is not a command. Excuse me. They're saying this is not a command or whatever, like Paul is saying here. I think it's important to note that some of those challenges can be very helpful for us. We know that it's not a legitimate thing to say, well, you're not reading your Bible enough. You know, I mean that's just such a subjective thing in a sense, and certainly we can encourage each other to do that. Though you could get a Bible reading plan and say, call a brother or sister, say, hey, I'm going to start on this plan. You want to go along in there with me? And that can be a good challenge, and that can bring about good things, because what that can do is that can bring good conversations between you two. Maybe others start in on it as well. So grace and comfort, of course, go directly together. And that really seems to be the goal of this letter. And the interesting thing about it, too, is you think about it, the righteous heart welcomes rebuke. Right? The Proverbs tell us that plainly. The righteous heart welcomes rebuke in love. And that really speaks toward what our goals ought to be in terms of understanding that comfort is not just what I think that comfort is. It's what God tells me that comfort is. Grace is not just what I want it to be, but it's what God tells me it is. So we remember that as we move forward in our study. Some things that we recall, this is in Paul's third journey. He is writing this seemingly from possibly from Ephesus, possibly from Macedonia as well. But regardless, that's about the time period that he's doing it. He's talking about the difficulties that they had in Ephesus and the trials that came upon them. And also in Macedonia, we talked about that as well. But now in chapter 8, remember we've moved on to this section where he's talking about the gift for the saints in Judea. And we had essentially concluded that this is not the same famine that we had with Agabus proclaiming it in Acts. But we keep in mind this is likely an ongoing issue of persecution for the brethren in Jerusalem. Their livelihoods are likely being either taken away from them directly, or just they're not able to make a living in such severe persecution. So that's the pressure that they're under. And that pressure is fueling the desire for other saints to help them out and try to alleviate that pressure. And so we are again, it's very difficult for us to understand because we're so far removed from true lack in this country. It's hard for us to really understand what that is and what that means. I'm not to say that there aren't some in this country that do understand that, but those who lived through the Depression, I think, have some understanding of that. What do? You pull back and you make do with what you have. And even right now, in terms of how things are going in this country, people are doing that overall. So we kind of have an understanding of this suffering that they were going through. But the wonderful thing about all this in chapters 8 and 9 is the motive for it, the motive for the relief of that suffering. It kind of came to my mind as I was prepping chapter 9 that, anybody in this world can do something good for someone else, can't they? Yes. They can see someone in need, they can go and help them. And in fact, I have no doubt that there are plenty of good people, I say good accommodatively, that have done that out of the purity of a good heart. People who are atheists, people who are agnostic, people who are of whatever religion have done good for others. But I'm reminded, of course, back in Romans 6, where he says, what was the fruit of those things in which you, I don't want to mess that up. Let me go to Romans 6, and I believe it's 21. Yeah. What fruit did you have then in the things of which you are now ashamed? And he goes on, the end of those things is death. So there's something different about a Christian doing these things versus someone who's just out there in the world. Certainly, God sees such things and he's pleased. I think we have nowhere else that we have to turn to but Acts 10 to note that Cornelius, someone who was a sinner, his good deeds and his prayers came up as in the visage of God, basically. God recognized what he had been doing and all those good things. And that was at least partly why, it seems, he indicated, you go and listen to this guy named Peter. Look for him. Whatever he tells you to do, you do it. But even then, we know that there was still a lack for Cornelius in that situation. So as we talk about this giving, as Paul is encouraging them, charging them to follow up on their previous plans, the devil is going to make it very easy for us just to kind of delegitimize this and say, well, this is not really that big of a deal. People help each other out every day. You know, a Christian helping another Christian out, it's the bare minimum of what you should do. And yes, it is. But you look at how Paul talks about it in chapter 9 and the lofty kind of language he uses for it. It's very helpful for us and encouraging for us because, yes, this is a specific collection. Yes, this is a specific time and place for this. But we also appreciate the fact that so much of this is still so applicable to what we deal with and what we work through today. Any questions or comments? And I should ask, too, any thoughts on chapter 8? Because we did we didn't really cover the last verses, 16 through 24, in detail. But I didn't know if anybody had any points they wanted to bring up and didn't bring up Sunday. Okay. So we move forward, and I would divide this really into two sections in this chapter, verses 1 through 5, concerning their readiness, which also really, again, to me, kind of dovetails off the previous chapter. I think we still have the same flow here because he's going back to what he talked about before, right? It's all the same topic and all the same subject. The collection for the saints, the ministering, the diakona, the service to the saints is the idea there. And he deals with that in the first 5 verses. Then verses 6 through 15 really brings it to a point where he's really laying out and breaking down what this does for them and the benefits that it has for them. Let me just briefly ask, when we give someone something, even if it's just a gift in terms of they have a need, even if there's a need involved, is there not a temptation sometimes to think of that gift as a loss for you? I think it is. I think any of us that says, well, there's maybe some of us are better at giving than others, but I think it's difficult for us to say that, well, that here is wealth, here is value that's leaving my hands and going into someone else's hands. But Paul doesn't talk about it that way, does he? And he makes it clear that this is not a loss. And we're going to keep hammering that to talk about that point because apparently there was some hesitancy with the brethren in Corinth concerning this. They'd had a year. They were zealous about it. And we're even going to see that their zeal affected others. Their zeal was something that others could see and understand. So that all brings it together for us there. But it's so helpful for us to think about that in that way. There are so many ways that carnal thinking will leak into how we view the church. We start to think, well, we've got to keep we got to stay in the black or something like that. We think of it as a business. And again, I'm not saying we expend ourselves into oblivion, but I think we have to be careful about thinking of it like that, don't we? Sometimes elders are chosen for their business acumen rather than their spiritual mind. And that can be a serious problem. And in our giving, I don't know if anybody's ever run into this, but I've heard of it before and run into it before, where someone kind of tends to think, well, I've been to this church for years and years, and I've given so much to the treasury, and they think of that as almost like a health savings account or something, where they've added up into it, and the more they've given, the more say they ought to have, and the more clout they ought to have. But that's not a biblical notion either. So we want to think about giving in the way that God shows it, in the way God talks about it. Question 1 on our sheet here, page 13. What word does Paul use to describe the need for such writing about this ministry to the saints?
It was superfluous or no need, unnecessary.
Absolutely.
For him to write to them.
Absolutely. Verse 1, again, in sort of I really think this is the same line of thought. Verse 1, now concerning the ministry to the saints, it is superfluous for me to write to you. That word really speaks toward beyond an overflow, an extraordinariness. That term is actually used in another place. If you look at James 1:21, James 1:21, it's used in a very negative sense in this passage. James 1 and verse 21. Therefore lay aside all filthiness and overflow of wickedness, and receive with meekness the implanted word which is able to save your soul. Somebody with a King James Version, how does that read about the wickedness part? Naughtiness? Superfluidity of naughtiness, which is just an interesting and odd phrase to us. But that's what it's talking about. It's an overflow of wickedness. It's too much wickedness. And that really is what that is speaking toward. We're going back to here, it's beyond what I need to say to you, is what Paul is saying. Yes, sir.
The phrase before that statement, all filthiness. So you have filthiness and
right.
Superfluity of knowledge. It's bad enough with superfluity of knowledge, but you put filthiness, but it's intensified, isn't it?
Yeah. But then this is, I think back in chapter 9, verse 1 of 2 Corinthians, this is really a very positive thing. It's superfluous, it's overflowing, it's beyond what I need to say to write to you concerning these things. There are other passages we could look to, and I could have listed them, but the thought that I don't need to write to you about this now. Hebrews also explicitly mentions that. He mentions Melchizedek. I have many things to say, but you're not ready to hear that now, kind of idea. So this is something that he's saying, and it's funny too because he's saying it's superfluous, but then he goes on to say it anyway, which tells you something about how they are. It's not necessary for him to say anything, but he says it anyway, which tells me there is an implication here that, hey, you said you do this. Really, let's pull this together. Let's actually follow through with your intentions and move forward with that.
What about 8:4? Chapter 8, verse 4, I believe it was. Had something to say about that. Imploring you with much urgency that you would receive the gift and fellowship of the ministering to the saints. Is that connected to that?
Yeah, the ministering to the saints would be associated with this. Okay. I think in chapter 8 and chapter 9, it's the same collection. Okay. It seems to be this is for needy saints in Judea. And I think we've already kind of dealt with that and talked about generally in the book that you have that sense that this is for them in Jerusalem, in Judea, in that region. And again, we've talked about how that seems to be the result of persecution. So, yeah, same idea. The ministering, the service to the saints. And I'll say again, it is so interesting when you start really looking for that word saints in the New Testament and how often you see it and who it's talking to and who it's talking about. And to keep in mind and to realize that all of us who are baptized into Christ and have died with him, every single one of us are saints. Saint is not this special title for special kinds of people. Someone kind of says, well, I'm no saint. Well, you need to be. We all need to be saints. And that doesn't really have much to do with our behavior except that we've died with Christ. So, the ministering to the saints. This leads us to verse 2. He says, for I know your willingness, about which I boast of you to the Macedonians, that Achaia was ready a year ago, and your zeal has stirred up the majority. Yet I have sent the brethren, lest our boasting of you should be in vain in this respect, that, as I said, you may be ready. Lest if some Macedonians come with me and find you unprepared, we, not to mention you, should be ashamed of this confident boasting. Therefore I thought it necessary to exhort the brethren to go to you ahead of time and prepare your generous gift beforehand, which you had previously promised, that it may be ready as a matter of generosity and not as a grudging obligation. So we might note, by the way, verse 4 is also a little bit more evidence that he's writing this from Macedonia, because he's saying, if some Macedonians come with me, well, why would they be coming with him? Well, he's already in Macedonia. So they would be coming along with him if he's going to Corinth after this. So, question 2 is what this leads us to. What boast had Paul made that stirred up the Macedonians to give so generously?
Talking about their zeal and getting ready to do it.
Yeah. I mean, hey, these brethren are on fire for this. They're excited. They want to help these brethren over here who are suffering so greatly. I mean, what do people say when they're trying to get you to give money for a cause? They want to point out, here's the problem, here's the need, here's the suffering. So likely that would have been in the conversation, but especially their zeal, the brethren in Corinth's zeal. And you think about it too, these brethren have been fighting and dealing with a number of things, but I think really when you consider if their response to 1 Corinthians 16 and other passages was to say, wow, we really got to do this. We really have to help these brethren. What a glory to God. You know, even in the midst of all the issues that they're dealing with. And that's one of the great lessons for us, isn't it, in the middle of all this? Paul is able to see, even in the midst of all their issues, like, here's some good things here. And to appreciate those things. And to bring up those things and tell those good things to others. And share that with others. So that their zeal, their enthusiasm, their eagerness stirred up many. It provoked the majority. And so that really is so encouraging, because it tells us too that even if I have some things wrong with me, as long as I'm working on what needs to be taken care of, and as long as I'm doing what the Lord tells me to do, accomplishing those things. Yeah, we're all going to have our flaws, we're all going to have our faults, but on points where we can really do something significant, we don't really need to be too hesitant on those things. Things where we know this is the right thing to do, and we have the ability to do it. Question 3, how might the promised bountiful gift from the Corinthians be negatively affected? What would make it kind of...
Well, if they kind of forgotten or trailed off on it,
Yes.
really been affected.
Absolutely. And that is such a natural and identifiable thing, I think, to us. Because so many of us, right, how many times have we had a project that we think of that falls by the wayside? That happens all throughout. You know, I can tell you at least 3 honeydews that are sitting in my workshop right now. But the thing that we want to appreciate here is that he is kind of saying, hey, I really want you to keep in mind this. I want you to watch out for this. I've sent the brethren. And I guess some people, I guess in a sense, you could interpret that as say, oh, well, now he's really trying to get onto us now. But he sent them, lest our boasting of you should be vain. Because here's the neat thing, too. They showed the zeal to Paul. Paul shared the zeal with the Macedonians. Now what happens if nothing comes of it? Well, now Paul's word might even be suspect to the Macedonians in that case. You said that they would be along with us in this. There's the sense, too, where this ties back, I think, to 1 Corinthians 16, where he's talking about you get that collection together so I don't have to go around collecting it when I come. And that seems to be echoed here. Go to you ahead of time, prepare your generous gift beforehand, get it all ready and get it together. That it may be ready as a matter of generosity and not as a grudging obligation. That's so important for us to learn from, isn't it? We don't give out of saying, well, I guess I have to do this. It really should be I get to do this. And this includes, too, I thought about this in terms of, okay, is this individual benevolence or is this congregational benevolence? In the context, of course, this is congregational benevolence. But I think there are principles of giving here that really transcend that context in a way, right? Whatever my giving is, I think I need to have, can I have a grudging obligation with helping out a brother, just one person to another? No, we don't want that. And the Lord is not going to be pleased with that. So that's going to negatively affect what's going on. We don't want this we want this to be a good thing. We don't want this to leave, as I say, a bad taste in somebody's mouth. Any thoughts or questions about that first section? I have a number of passages here concerning giving, especially in terms of shame. Because what Paul is really saying here, he's saying, I don't want you to be humiliated. I don't want you to be he's not saying it to say like, hey, you better, as we mentioned Sunday, put up or shut up. It's not just that. It's that he cares for them. He doesn't want them to be in a place where they're looked down upon because they didn't follow up with what they intended to do. And that needs to be, Paul is such a great example for us in that, isn't it? Our goal needs to be among each other. We're not holding each other to task to make each other feel bad necessarily or to guilt us into something that we may not want to do. If there's guilt, we handle it in the way that we handle it. But the whole point seems to be that I care about you. I care about your work in the Lord. And I want it to come across in the right way. And that speaks so much toward what we need to be doing. In Romans, Mark 8:38, you remember when Jesus said there, if any man is ashamed of me, then the Son of Man will be ashamed of him. That's a crass generalization. Whoever is ashamed of me and my words, this adulterous and sinful generation, of him the Son of Man also will be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. That's the same basic concept talked about in verse 4. That we, not to mention you, should be ashamed of this confident boasting. Imagine giving in this way and being ashamed about it, right? You took us seriously? We were supposed to have that ready now? And then we scramble together. Well, that's going to be a source of shame. And the Bible speaks in various places concerning shame. And shame is not something that we should just bury and act like it doesn't exist. There are certain things that are shameful. And again, we don't have the time to look through all these passages, but they're just variations of that idea of shame and being ashamed. Paul says in Romans 1:16, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. So what we want is, we want to be ashamed of the things that are shameful and not ashamed of the things that are not shameful. Sometimes we can get those mixed up very much. And as I say, the solution to shame is grace, and that works back into our context. The next section is the rest of the chapter. Let's read through that, 6 through 15. 6 through 15. Paul says, "But this I say, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and he who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. So let each one give as he purposes in his heart, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to make all grace abound toward you, that you, always having all sufficiency in all things, may have an abundance for every good work. As it is written, he is dispersed abroad, he is given to the poor, his righteousness endures forever. Now may he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food supply and multiply the seed you have sown, and increase the fruits of your righteousness, while you are enriched in everything for all liberality, which causes thanksgiving through us to God. For the administration of this service not only supplies the needs of the saints, but also is abounding through many thanksgivings to God, while through the proof of this ministry they glorify God for the obedience of your confession to the gospel of Christ, and for your liberal sharing with them and all men, and by their prayer for you, who long for you because of the exceeding grace of God in you. Thanks be to God for his indescribable gift." And you may note too, and I may have more to say about this in verse 13, the liberal sharing with them and with all men. That's where I kind of look at this as a lot of the principles he's laying down here transcend whether this is individual or collective benevolence. On a collective level, they did not have authority, and we don't have authority to help others on an individual basis. We don't have a scriptural authority to take the church treasury and just divvy it out to all men everywhere. That's just, we don't have that. We don't have an example of the church doing that. But we do have examples of the church collectively saying, okay, here's some brethren, here's a group of brethren over there who have need. We're going to get a collection together, and we're going to send this collection off to them. And the thought of the treasury being in there, again, we could go into the details and the weeds here. We don't have the time. But the treasury is just inherent and implicit in the whole thing. You just really see it all throughout scriptures in terms of these particular cases. So this leads us into question 4. What sowing and reaping principle applies to the giving of believers?
You sow sparingly, you'll reap sparingly. You sow bountifully, you'll reap bountifully. Verse 6.
Okay. It's kind of interesting, too, because obviously there's a real world, I guess real world be an odd way to phrase it, but there's an application of this, I think, to gardening, right? If you don't put very many seeds, right, you're not going to get very many sprouts. And so we know that and we see that. But in this context, too, it's essentially saying, what if I decide, kind of like, I really think Ananias and Sapphira are a pretty good example of this, right? They intend and say, well, here's this big thing that we did, but then really it was only a certain amount they did. And we talk about it, we study in Acts. If they had just been honest about what they did, I'm not sure there would have been a problem, because Peter said, this was yours. And you had control over it to do what you wanted. But you said it was something that it wasn't. And they had lied to the Holy Spirit. So that really informs us to know that I have to be willing to say, okay, I'm not going to try to limit this. I'm not going to try to pare this down. This is helpful for us in our giving because it's helpful for us to conclude, okay, certainly as we talked about Sunday, I don't think that we have here a requirement that I'm spending myself out of house and home to support the church. But I do think you have a principle here that there needs to be a constant willingness. the willingness we talked about Sunday morning, and then the fact that that he's talking about how much they're helping them. And we know and already covered in chapter 8 that this, in the application, we're dealing with more than just money. Time, effort, all of these things work together. And even those that don't have a whole lot of money can give a whole lot of other resources they might have. So, yes, sir.
You think verse 6 is it's a ratio, right? A little bit gets a little bit, a lot gets back a lot. Do you think we could use this in other areas? Is this a guarantee? Or is this a general, an obvious lesson? You're not going to get a roll of corn if you put out 2 seeds.
Yeah.
It's not a guarantee of that, right? It's not.
That's true.
We don't want to say, we may give bountifully in some of our time or our money.
Yeah.
And there may not be a great return sometimes.
You're right.
And again, that's what we deal with. That's okay. Because once it left my hand, it wasn't mine anymore anyway.
Yeah.
But we can't really necessarily take this and apply it. Because so God said if I do this,
Right.
that.
Well,
It's a contextual
yeah.
phrase, right? That verse 6. I mean, you can't take it out of context.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It doesn't work. It certainly doesn't work in investing, does it? Like, one of the big news points right now, the guy that lost people billions of dollars or whatever, you could have put bountifully into that, but you've lost it all now. So yeah, no, I think what you're saying is so spot on, and our expectations are a big part of that, aren't they? Oh, I've done this big thing for them. Surely they'll do something back nice to me. Well, that's not for certain. And it may not even be intentional that they don't do that, by the way. Go ahead.
It might be, I'm picturing talking to your son and saying, well, how do I know? Well, if you don't work hard, you're certainly not going to get it, right? So if you don't put the effort in, you're certainly not going to get it much better. So you can't put, I guess what the principle is you can't put a little and get a lot.
Right.
But it doesn't guarantee that.
Yeah. And I don't think, I'm not for sure, but it seems to come across here, this may not really be an instance of, if you sow sparingly, you're not going to be a faithful Christian per se. I don't think it's to that point. I think it really comes back to the example of the good ground, some 30, some 60, some 100-fold. I was talking with a brother earlier today about how we only have a certain set of time in our lives to do work in God's kingdom. And we literally can't get all of it done. There's no way we could do everything we need to do in terms of the service of God. But the beautiful thing about that is we also have eternity. And whatever we don't get done here, we keep working on over there. And that's the glory here. But we don't take that. We don't need to take that and say, well, I don't really have to do too much. And we also shouldn't be so worried about, I'm not doing enough. I've got to find a place where I'm fulfilling this in a clear way. Ms. Linda.
We have to look too that what we get back is not necessarily going to be the same thing that we suffer. We have our eternal way of glory, in the end, even if we don't get anything back from any earthly person, but we still have that we know that God's looking at what we do.
Yeah. And that's where kind of the trial comes in, is that, you're always, I say always, but you may always feel like you're operating in a lack, but that doesn't mean you stop. You keep moving forward. You keep moving ahead. You think about all the things that Paul talks about that he lacked, the things that he suffered. And it becomes a little easier for us to say, okay, well, I can see what he put up with and what he suffered through. And if he got through that, then it means I can get through what I'm dealing with. So this also kind of speaks toward other passages that we might look at. I don't think I had it on here, but he says in Galatians 6 and verse 7, right? Whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. Now, this is not really the same context, is it? It's the same terminology. This is really speaking more of, here's, if you let in a lot of Satan inside your heart, That's what you're going to start saying. That's what you're going to start doing. That's how you're going to start acting. If you sow to the flesh, you'll reap corruption. If you sow to the Spirit. I don't think that's what he's talking about here in chapter 9, but the sowing and the reaping is absolutely, it would have been familiar terminology to them. And it's familiar terminology to us. So he says in verse 7, let each one give as he purposes in his heart. And we talk about that. This needs to be a purposeful thing. Again, not out of grudge or necessity. Leads us to question 5. What additional factors mentioned in chapter 9, verse 7, besides the one mentioned in 8:12, determine whether one's giving is acceptable?
Whether they have purpose in their heart is what to give. I have number 1, giving from the heart. Number 2, not giving grudgingly or of necessity.
Mm-hmm. For the reason, the explanation is God loves a cheerful giver. God loves a giver that says, just like what Scott was saying, you remember, and one of the things that help us too with this is where grace comes in. Everything I have it through the grace of God. I don't have a car to drive necessarily because I worked for it and I paid for it and blah, blah, blah. Technically, if you want to say that, but where'd you get your money from? Who brought about that situation providentially that you were able to have a job and to be able to have that wealth or support, however you want to say it. So it's so helpful for us to note, because when I operate at a loss, I can go back and I can say, well, it was all grace to start with. I never necessarily earned that, which is such a bizarrely different thought process than what we have in this country. In this country, the classical thought is you work for what you earn. You work for what you have. And there are many people that, even though they may say they don't really believe that, they will sort of live that way. And what they end up doing is they end up shutting off their heart from others. And that there's not a sharing in that. And that leads us really to what we're talking about with the rest of the section here. Question 6. I'm sorry. I'm losing on my PowerPoint here. I had some passages up in Proverbs up there concerning the giving and what you get back from it. We just don't have time to get into that. But I did want to mention with question 5, a grudge. Really talking about a grief over what I might think of as loss here will destroy my heart. It's the thought that, and sometimes we say this, and we say most important is God, others than me. I don't know. I have my qualms about that, because I think for me to care for others, I've got to make sure that I'm standing right in God. Love your neighbor as yourself. And for me to love myself, that's not talking about just give myself whatever I might want in that passage. It's saying I've got to be able to respect myself. I've got to be able to look in the mirror and say, yeah, I'm serving God faithfully. And that gives you that stand to be able to say, okay, now I can help my brother. And it really helps us to think about that, because if it's just a sense where I'm constantly emptying myself for others, with no real sense of grace, with no real sense of understanding that I'm in a good place and I can help this person. What you end up doing is you just end up exhausting yourself. You end up possibly building up.
That's where the purpose in the heart comes in.
Yes.
We have X number of resources to give from, and we have to purpose in our heart what we can give out of that and still maintain the other commands and regulations that we have. I have known of people giving, when they say beyond their means, how long can you do that and sustain your family? So you have to purpose. Can I give God my fair share? Can I give my fellow man their fair share and still give to the responsibilities that I have as an individual?
Yes.
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up, because that's another big point of all this is that you have to put some thought into this. It takes time to kind of do this it's easy for us to just, kind of be like the guy in a parade, tossing out money. Yes, sir.
The denominations, I think, fail in this a lot of times, among other things, and they say, you got to give from faith.
Mm-hmm.
How can you foretell what's going to happen tomorrow? I mean, that's not faith. It's faith is blind faith.
Mm-hmm.
They want to build, for instance, where we came from.
Yeah.
One group in there built a huge building,
Mm-hmm.
3 times more than they needed.
Yeah.
Everyone in the country around there for 50 miles set in to build a bigger building. And they were, they want you to put down on a card what you intend to give.
Yeah.
And it created a real problem and kind of divided that church.
Well, and I think we can see a difference between like saying, hey, we're going to build this huge building and, you got to have faith, God will send the people to fill it, versus saying, okay, here are some brethren that need help. Here's a specific amount that they need to kind of make things work for them. And we have that amount, and it's not going to exhaust our funds. It's not, we can see how that's different, right? And we can take the time to say, okay, can we do this? Are we able to do this? Yes, we should do this. I really appreciate those thoughts there. Question 6, what should the abounding of God's grace among the Corinthians produce?
Every good work.
I'm sorry?
Every good work.
Every good work. Yeah. That reminds us, right, of 2 Timothy 3:16. Scripture is able to give the man of God the proper preparation for every good work. You be able to do all these things. Yes, sir.
You take back to his Al's thing about the denominations. Some believe Calvinistically that works has nothing to do with it. But why does God supply you with what you need to do good works?
Right.
That works are important, but they're God's works, not your works.
True. Yeah, it's what I have here is it's not just the gift; it's what comes from the gift. We want to keep that in mind. And then the great statement in this verse: God is able.
Yes.
God can do this. That brings a great joy and comfort that materialism does not give. In this world, if you lose everything, you lose everything. Kind of back to this guy that lost people billions of money. I've heard today him kind of saying like, well, I'll do everything I can to try to help with this or whatever. But it's like, you think about it, it's like, no, what are you going to do? The money's gone. You're not going to find that anywhere. And that's if you understand that God can do more than this world, not just in money, but in terms of our time and our effort, our giving in general, it's so helpful for us to understand God is able. He's the one that's able to do these things. I'm going to hold off on that question with question 7. Anybody have any thoughts or questions before we finish up tonight?
I just want to say, along with, however we view how we stand after God, the heart of the servant motivates us to be giving, motivates us to seek the well-being of other people. And that's integral to what we are supposed to be as Christians. And whether we put that second, third, fourth, or fifth, we've got to first be servants in order to be a child of God.
Amen.
As long as we have the right attitude, it's what Jesus said in Acts 20:35, that recited by Paul, it is more blessed to give than to receive. It's what it does for you spiritually, not what it does necessarily for the ones you're giving to, but you're doing what God favors.
Yeah, it's all wrapped up together, isn't it? There's a benefit for both. And I think that's what we can talk about Sunday morning with what Paul further says there. Anything else? All right. Thank you so much for your time.